Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to be here today with John Pettigrew, the Chief Executive of National Grid. There was a time when utilities' mission was relatively simple, even if the business of meeting it was complex. And the mission was essentially to deliver reliable, affordable electricity. And now utilities are at the heart of the energy transition. That's both because they're the companies that are going to decarbonize the electricity sector, and also because a decarbonized electricity system helps you reduce emissions from other sectors, including transport and buildings. John runs National Grid, which operates on both sides of the Atlantic and has been looking at this challenge and opportunity in the UK and in America. So very grateful for having him here. Thanks, John.
Charlotte.
I was wondering if you could start by giving us a bit of a sense of the state of play in Britain, which is further ahead than America on its journey towards decarbonization. If you could give some perspective about your experience to date, your work on reducing emissions, how you've been able to deal with some of the complexities of balancing intermittency, keeping the grid balanced, that'd be hugely helpful.
Yeah, so thank you. I think over the last decade, what we've seen in the UK is significant progress. The amount of offshore wind that we've now got and onshore wind is in excess of 20 gigawatts. And at the same time, we've got about 12 gigawatts of solar on a system that at its peak needs about 50 to 55 gigawatts. So we've seen a massive increase in the amount of renewables. And as we've done that, we've faced some challenges in the way that we have to operate the system. So, when you've got renewable generation, it's either there or it's not. So it's not like traditional generation that is rotating. So you get a much more stable system with traditional generation. But renewables creates new challenges for our system operator, and you have to develop new services, both on the demand side and with new players, actually, to be able to manage the system in real time. And we saw this really significantly, actually, in the last year. Because of COVID in the UK, we saw a massive reduction in demand. And therefore, during the summer, we had long periods where the only thing supporting the demand in the UK was renewables and nuclear. And what that's done is really accelerate our thinking in terms of what we need to do to be able to operate the system in absolute real time with only renewables on the system. So it's a bit like we've been accelerated 5 years forward. So we're expecting to see a lot more renewable generation, but COVID actually tested us to actually operate the system with only renewables and nuclear, and that was quite a challenge. But we saw a way through it, and as a result, we've accelerated the development of a lot of new products to help us balance the system.
So that's very tempting. What are those new products? That's kind of the magic key, right? Is how to get more and more renewables on the system quickly and then figure out a solution to keeping the grid balanced. So what did you do?
Yeah, so the key thing is really developing products which are much more fast acting. So battery storage is a fantastic ancillary service for the system operator because you can get vast amounts of power in milliseconds. And actually, when you're trying to balance renewables, which can be there and then suddenly not there, that type of product is really helpful. The other thing we've seen is a massive increase in the demand side. So whereas in the UK, historically, it's been pretty much a one-sided market where it's the supply side that's either increased the generation or reduced its generation to meet demand. What we've seen is new players coming into the market, both industrial and commercial, a lot of aggregators who are offering demand-side management services, competing with what were the traditional generators or indeed with the battery storage providers as well.
That's fascinating. And are there upgrades to the grid that are needed to manage that different way of keeping the grid balanced going forward? Or have you been able to do this without massive investment and it's new players coming on and offering services without having to do big investment on your part?
No, there's huge investment now needed. So the UK government, just before Christmas, set out what's called its 10-point plan. And as part of that, it's set an ambition of 40 gigawatts of offshore wind in the UK by 2030. So just to give you a sense, we've got about 10 today. And at the same time, they've accelerated, like many countries have, the desire to get to electric vehicles as well. So the result of that is there's a need for a massive amount of investment onshore to facilitate the transport of that energy. So in the UK, most of that offshore wind is going to come in on the East Coast, but it's a long way away from where the demand is. So we're going to have to reinforce large swathes of the system And that creates real challenges, both in terms of physically building that much infrastructure in that short space of time, but also it creates issues of planning. And it's the same in the US where we operate there as well. People are very keen on the journey to net zero and decarbonisation, but people feel very frustrated when they have to have infrastructure in their backyard that will deliver that energy. So you have to manage that very carefully. So planning issues are something that we're having to navigate at the moment in the UK.
And is that something where there's a streamlined decision-making process in America, which I'm more familiar with? I think that probably is streamlined would be the antithesis of the word to describe planning long-distance transmission. So in Britain, is there a model that's evolving that you think is workable, or is it still very much in question?
Well, about 7 years ago, they changed the model to try and improve it, to actually speed up the ability to get infrastructure built and actually to do a lot more engagement with local communities about what it meant for them. Unfortunately, it's still too slow. So National Grid has just started building the transmission line that's going to support the new nuclear power station in Somerset called Hinkley C. That took about 5 or 6 years from planning to actually putting a shovel in the ground to get the planning consents. So when you're trying to build 30 gigawatts of offshore wind in a decade, that's not going to work. The good news is that the government has recognised that in the UK, so they're now doing a review of our planning process to see if there are ways to simplify it and, put it simply, to speed it up, because we're not going to be able to deliver the targets for 2030 and 2040 unless we can build the infrastructure in a timely way.
Let's talk a little bit about EV infrastructure in Britain. In America, we talk about mandates and additional tax credits for EVs, but in Britain, you're doing something much more aggressive. So, first, if you could remind us of the targets around combustion engines and EVs, and then also what you need to do on your side to prepare for that rapid scale up of electric cars.
Yeah, so the UK government has just recently brought forward its ambition to have no internal combustion engines built from 2035. The challenge for us as a network operator is really to ensure that we're an enabler to that, and that when people want to charge, they're going to be able to do so. So National Grid actually over the last 18 months has been working with the UK government and other stakeholders on trying to look at what you would need to do to build a strategic charging network where everybody in the UK is never more than 50 miles away from an ultra-fast charging service station. To do that, you have to extend the networks to where the strategic roads are. It's very achievable, but a significant task. The real challenge that we all have is that at the moment, the number of electric vehicles in the UK, I think, is about 150,000. The targets have been set are in the sort of tens of millions over the next decade. So the question is, when is it going to suddenly accelerate up? And at that point, make sure you've got sufficient charging available. So at the moment, utilization in certain places is very low, and therefore the commercial model doesn't really work. So there's a sort of balancing act to be done. You need to do the infrastructure investment, but it needs to come in a timely fashion when utilization grows. And of course, from a utility perspective, what we don't want to be is in a position where people buy electric vehicles because the cost of them is coming down all the time, but they can't charge in a sort of sensible way. And again, in the UK, about 40% of people don't have off-road parking, so they will be charging from public facilities. So we have to invest to make sure those public facilities are there.
So one of the things that can provide a bit of certainty, at least on the investment side, is having clear government policy. Let's switch over to the American side, where there's clear ambition from the Biden administration to do something proactively, but it's not the scale at which that ambition will be able to be effectuated is very unclear at the moment. So describe a bit the investment environment in the US, in addition to how you think about the federal challenge, the federal regulatory landscape evolving, and then what you've seen on the states, within the states. So some of these issues are the same, right, in the US as they are in the UK. They're just happening within a very different political landscape.
Yeah, there's probably more similarity than difference when you stand back and look at it. So the states that we operate in the northeast of the US have all got very ambitious targets for net zero and decarbonisation of both the electricity and the gas systems. Clearly, with the Biden administration coming in, we've seen quite a quick reversal of some of the policies that were there before, particularly around things like combustion engines, as well as potentially large stimulus coming forward. I think the number is about $2 trillion has been referenced. From our perspective, I guess it's how that manifests itself in support, either in regulatory frameworks or in planning issues or in stability. As a private investor, what you really want is a clear regulatory framework and clear government policy and clear strategies. Once they're in place, you can then invest in those assets. And most of the investment that we do, like most utilities, is very long cycle. Our assets are there for 40, 50, 60 years. So the ambition is great, and there's a lot of positive sentiment coming out from federal government. We're very keen now to see how that translates into actual support, whether it's for offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, or indeed transmission. And that's a very similar issue in the US to the UK, in that it is quite clear that more transmission is going to need to be built in the US because a lot of the renewable sources are far away from where the conurbations of demand are. But actually getting it built is a real challenge. And it's interesting to see that FERC, who administers transmission, has got a new chair. And at a recent EEI conference was talking about his ambition to make sure that actually they can enable and support the green agenda going forward in the US. So we're quite excited to see how that's going to play out. But clarity of policy, clear regulatory frameworks, and then stability is what we're looking for.
To date in the US, because you have had, as you say, quite ambitious states, but from Massachusetts to New York, the precise regulations differ, right? Even though they both want to be moving towards net zero. So can you describe how that patchwork has affected the way that you invest, or has it been immaterial?
We've been very lucky, to be honest, because the states have set very ambitious targets, and we work very closely with our regulators and with the states to make sure that we support them. Now, at heart, what we're trying to do is be an enabler to decarbonisation, so we want to be aligned with how our states operate. So what we try and do is create optionality for our states by setting out what investments we believe are necessary to support their goals. Some things you just have to get on with to be able to meet the targets. Sometimes you need to balance the speed of that investment with things like affordability. So, if you think about the economic impact of COVID at the moment, it would be quite easy to rush into a lot of investment into infrastructure, but ultimately customers pay the bills. So we have to balance it in terms of making sure that what we're doing is affordable. And I guess one of the big differences that we're starting to see, perhaps in Europe and the UK, is around things like the future of gas, actually, and the way that people are thinking about hydrogen. So certainly in the US at the moment, from my perspective, it seems that everybody has jumped to electrification of heat as the long-term solution. Whereas in Europe and in the UK, there's a lot more discussion around the role that renewable gas and hydrogen and carbon capture and storage could play. And that's probably the one area that is least certain as I think about the journeys that we're on for net zero. So decarbonisation of generation, it's pretty clear it's going to be a wind, solar solution. Electrification of transport, it's just a matter of timing. But when it gets to decarbonisation of heat, is it going to be electrification? Is it going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be a blend? That is still uncertain, and there's a lot of work to be done to really work out what that roadmap looks like.
Yeah, it's interesting because the US, which has a lot of gas, I agree with you, the conversation has moved towards electrification, and Europe, which needs to import more gas, seems a bit more open to at least the idea of renewable gas, as you say, and certainly hydrogen is a strategic industrial priority. Before we move on to heating and some other sectors, though, I do want to ask, because I'm so interested in your answer on demand response in the UK, in addition to batteries as helping to stabilize the grid. Can those two forms of stabilization do the job? Do you think there needs to be a large role just within electrification of the grid, not talking about heating or power for industry, but just electrification of the grid? Can renewables plus demand side response and storage do the job, or do you need to still have natural gas with CCS, nuclear, et cetera, to provide that firm power that grids have historically relied on?
Yeah, I think our view at the moment is you're probably going to need more than just battery storage to be able to manage that intermittency. It certainly has got a massive role to play in our view, but you do need that flexibility, particularly potentially over longer periods of time. So there are periods that we see where the wind doesn't blow for several days, with weather fronts. And the economics of storage is great, but it tends to come in short bursts. And therefore, having some flexibility, whether it is through hydrogen generation or whether it's carbon capture and storage, we are seeing some of our wind farms starting to develop ancillary services, but they are very much in the infancy. So as we sit here today and you look at technology, I think you'd say that you probably need some other flexible generation on the network as well as just batteries. But technology is moving all the time and new opportunities coming forward from the demand side as well. But as I sit here today, I'd say you do need some of that flexibility from whether it is clean CCGTs or something equivalent.
So, as you think about the ways to accelerate this transition and to provide the support that you need in order to make decarbonization happen quickly, we've talked about the streamlining of transmission, but there's of transmission approvals. But there's certainly, I imagine, many more things that would be on your wish list. So, when you think about what sensible climate policy in the US might look like, what are lessons from the UK that you think should be brought over to America, or what are the big things that you would hope to see come out of Congress?
The most effective thing is, from a utility perspective, it's going to be about the ability to be able to build the infrastructure. So I know I've mentioned it already, but the thing that worries me most will be, can we build the transmission and the distribution systems that we need to support the renewables that will come? So, my aspiration is that the networks are never an inhibitor to achieving net zero. And the only way we can achieve that is by making sure that we make those investments up front. I guess, if I put a customer lens on it, if I did have a second aspiration, it would be around taking a longer term view of it. So if I use either the UK or the US and think about offshore wind, for example, if you're going to build 50 or 60 gigawatts of offshore wind off the northeast coast, or indeed in the North Sea in the UK, the best way to do that is to design the network to achieve that now and actually start to build it and let the generation come. And if you do that, it will actually minimize the cost for consumers. But it's quite hard, I think, in a political and regulatory environment that tends to be quite short cycle to imagine that world that may take 20 or 30 years to achieve and start to build a network trusting that it will come. So what you end up doing is doing everything incrementally. So if you look in the US and the UK, you'll see that individual wind farms are connecting directly to the network, but they're not coordinating in a way that would actually minimize costs for consumers. We're seeing a bit of that in the US as well. So I think a longer term vision and then a clear strategy and then the regulatory frameworks to support it could ultimately create the right balance between getting the job done for net zero and minimizing costs for consumers.
It's funny because the grid itself, in many ways, would seem to the random observer to be the least exciting part of the energy transition, right? And that people like to think about big offshore wind farms or solar farms or the new exciting technology in hydrogen. But as you say, it really is so essential to making these different pieces work together. Do you feel like there is a growing understanding? You talked about how in the UK there is a growing understanding that this needs to be an area of focus. Do you feel that in the United States, beyond FERC meetings, that there is a sense that among policymakers that this really does need to be a part of the answer?
Yeah, I do actually. I think we've seen it. We've seen it very clearly in Massachusetts in our own jurisdiction, where the support that was given for solar led to such a rush of solar wanting to connect to the system that actually the thing that was stopping it was the need to build the infrastructure. And it just takes time. So I think people are recognizing that if you want to achieve the goals for 2030, 2040, or 2050, then you need to have the network there to be able to provide it. Otherwise, you end up in a world where the generation either can't connect or is restricted. And we're seeing that in the UK. There are times where the wind generators are being constrained off the system because there are constraints on the system. And nobody wants that. You're actually constraining clean energy. So I think people are starting to see it in both the US and in the UK. And it comes back to trying to resolve those planning issues, get the right regulatory frameworks in place, and then giving people clarity on the policy. And then, from the private sector perspective, people will invest in these assets.
Listening to you, I'm struck by the consistency in what you're saying, which is essentially just give us a clear framework in which we can operate and in which we can make the investments that are needed, the investments that are needed to effectuate the vision as articulated by politicians. And it's not, in some ways, it's not rocket science, right? But it can be remarkably difficult to do in practice. So thank you for laying out the opportunity and the challenge that both Britain and America have over the next decade. Very grateful to you for your time and look forward to talking with you again soon, I hope.
Thank you very much, Charlotte.